A stranger's touch. John was an ordinary mechanic, the kind of man who preferred machines over people. He liked the hum of engines and the steady rhythm of tools in his hands. Late at night, while the starship docks were quiet, John often stayed back, fixing ships and enjoying the silence. That evening was no different, or so he thought. As he wiped his greasy hands on a rag, John heard soft footsteps behind him. He froze. It was unusual for anyone to be around this late. The docks were supposed to be empty. Turning slowly, he saw a figure stepping out of the shadows. It was a woman, tall and slender, but unlike any human he had ever seen. Her silver skin shimmered under the dim lights, and her eyes glowed faintly with a soft blue hue. She moved toward him with a surprising familiarity, as if she had known him for years. Before John could say anything, she threw her arms around him and hugged him tightly. "I thought I'd never see you again, human," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. John stiffened in her embrace, his mind racing. Who was she? Why was she hugging him? He gently pushed her away, staring into her glowing eyes. I think you have the wrong person," he said, his voice laced with confusion. "I don't know you." The woman pulled back just enough to look at him, but didn't let go entirely. Her expression softened, but there was a sadness in her glowing eyes. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked. "Remember you?" John repeated, now utterly baffled. He shook his head. "Lady, I don't even know who, or what, you are." Before she could reply, a loud explosion shook the shipyard. The ground beneath them trembled, and alarms began blaring throughout the docks. John instinctively ducked, looking around for the source of the noise. Sparks flew from a nearby terminal as the shipyard's automated defense systems activated. The air was suddenly filled with the sound of blaster fire and metal crashing. "They found me," the woman said, panic flashing across her face. She grabbed John's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "We have to leave now." "Wait, what? Who's after you?" John demanded, but she was already pulling him toward a nearby ship. It was an old, battered starship that looked like it hadn't flown in years. The kind of ship no one would think to check. "Just trust me," she shouted over the noise, her voice urgent. "If we stay, you'll die too." John hesitated. He didn't know this woman or why she was in trouble, but something in her voice made him follow her. As they ran, shadows moved in the distance. John glanced back and saw dark figures approaching. Armored soldiers carrying energy weapons. Whoever they were, they looked deadly. The woman punched a code into the ship's access panel, and the door hissed open. "Get in," she ordered. John didn't argue. As soon as he stepped inside, she slammed the door shut and ran to the cockpit. The engines roared to life, and the ship lifted off with a jolt. John stumbled into a seat, gripping the armrest as the ship veered sharply to avoid incoming fire. "Okay, now you have to tell me what's going on," he shouted. The woman didn't look at him. Her hands moved quickly over the controls, her focus entirely on flying. "There's no time," she said. "They'll chase us until we're out of their range." "Who are they?" John asked, his frustration growing. "And who are you?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she hit a button, and the ship jumped into hyperspace, the stars outside stretching into streaks of light. Only then did she turn to face him. "My name is Lyra," she said, her voice calmer now, but still heavy with urgency. "I'm the last of my kind, and they want me dead." "Great," John muttered, rubbing his temples. "So now I'm stuck with a fugitive alien." "Perfect." Lyra's eyes softened again, and she reached out to touch his hand. "You're not just some random human, John," she said quietly. "You're the reason I'm still alive. You saved me once, a long time ago." John stared at her, completely lost. "I think you've got me mixed up with someone else," he said. "I'm just a mechanic. I've never left this sector in my life." Lyra shook her head. "No, it's you. I'd recognize you anywhere. But they erased your memories to keep you from helping me." "Who's they?" John asked. But before Lyra could answer, the ship's warning system beeped loudly. "They followed us," she said, her face grim. "We're not safe yet." John looked out the window and saw sleek, black ships appearing behind them, their weapons charging. His stomach sank. He didn't know who Lyra was or why she thought he was important. But one thing was clear: his quiet, ordinary life was over. And it had just been replaced by chaos. Escape from the shadows. The hum of the hyperspace engines filled the cockpit as John sat rigidly in his seat. His heart was pounding from the chaos of their escape. He glanced at Lyra, who was busy scanning the ship's console, her glowing eyes darting between screens. The silence between them felt heavy, but John wasn't sure what to say. Questions swirled in his mind, but before he could open his mouth, the ship jolted violently. A blaring alarm echoed through the cabin. Lyra cursed under her breath, her calm demeanor cracking for the first time. "They found us," she muttered. John grabbed the edge of his seat as the ship rocked again. "What do you mean they found us? I thought hyperspace was supposed to keep us safe." Lyra didn't look at him, her fingers dancing across the controls. "They're using a tracker. I didn't think they'd be able to get through our signal cloaking this fast." "Who are they?" John asked, his voice rising in frustration. "You keep talking like I should know what's going on, but I don't." Lyra finally turned to him, her expression deadly serious. "They're called the Shadow Seekers. They hunt anyone who threatens their control over this galaxy. And right now, that includes me. And, by extension, you." John blinked. "Me? Why me? I'm just a mechanic. I've never done anything to threaten anyone." "You're more than that, John," Lyra said, her voice firm. "You don't remember, but you were once their greatest enemy." Before John could process her words, the ship lurched again. Through the viewport, dark, sleek ships appeared, emerging from hyperspace like predators closing in on their prey. Their triangular shapes gleamed menacingly against the backdrop of space. Energy blasts streaked toward them, lighting up the cockpit with flashes of red and white. Lyra gritted her teeth and yanked the controls, sending their ship into a sharp dive. John was thrown back in his seat as the ship narrowly avoided the incoming fire. "Hold on," she shouted. "Hold on to what?" John snapped, gripping the armrests as the ship banked hard to the left. The view outside became a blur of stars and lasers. "They'll tear us apart if we stay in open space," Lyra said, her voice strained. "We need cover." John leaned forward, his eyes scanning the control panel. He didn't know much about flying ships, but he'd spent years repairing them. "There's a moon nearby," he said, pointing to the navigation screen. "If we can get into its atmosphere, it might scramble their sensors." Lyra glanced at the display and nodded. "That's risky, but it's better than being sitting ducks out here." She angled the ship toward the moon, a barren, rocky sphere that seemed lifeless at first glance. The Shadow Seeker ships followed, their weapons still firing relentlessly. The blasts grew more intense as they neared the moon's gravity well. "Brace yourself," Lyra shouted as the ship plunged into the atmosphere. The hull groaned under the pressure, and flames licked at the edges of the viewport. John held his breath, his knuckles white as he clutched the armrests. The turbulence was brutal, shaking the ship like a leaf in a storm. Finally, they broke through the atmosphere, the fiery glow fading to reveal a desolate landscape of jagged cliffs and deep craters. Lyra brought the ship low, weaving between the rocky outcroppings in an attempt to lose their pursuers. The Shadow Seekers' ships followed, but their larger frames struggled to maneuver in the narrow canyons. Lyra took advantage of the terrain, darting through tight spaces and skimming the surface of a shallow crater. One of the enemy ships miscalculated a turn and smashed into a cliff, exploding in a brilliant flash of light. "That's one down," Lyra muttered, her focus unwavering. John exhaled sharply. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "No," Lyra said flatly, "but I'll enjoy surviving." The remaining ships pressed on, their weapons still firing. Lyra's ship took a hit to the rear thrusters, causing a warning light to flash on the console. "We're losing power," she said, her voice tense. "We need to land before we're grounded permanently." John scanned the terrain ahead and spotted a narrow canyon with enough cover to hide the ship. "There," he shouted. Lyra nodded and brought the ship down, the landing rough but manageable. She quickly powered down the engines to reduce their heat signature. The Shadow Seekers' ships roared overhead, their searchlights scanning the ground. Both John and Lyra sat in silence, barely breathing as the enemy ships passed by. After a few tense minutes, the lights faded, and the sound of engines grew distant. Lyra leaned back in her seat, exhaling deeply. "We bought ourselves some time," she said. John looked at her, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. "Okay, start talking. Who are you really? And why do these Shadow Seekers want me?" Lyra hesitated, her glowing eyes meeting his. "I told you, John. You don't remember, but you were once a hero, a leader who stood against them. They erased your memories to neutralize the threat you posed." John shook his head. "That doesn't make any sense. I'm just a mechanic. I don't even know how to fight." Lyra leaned closer, her voice soft but insistent. "You're more than you think you are. And if we don't figure out how to stop them, they'll destroy everything, including Earth." Before John could respond, a loud thud echoed from the back of the ship. Both of them froze, their eyes locking. "They'd found us," Lyra whispered. And just like that, the brief moment of calm shattered. The forgotten connection. The air inside the ship was tense. The faint hum of the systems running on reserve power echoed through the narrow corridors. John sat in the dimly lit cockpit, staring at Lyra, who was busy scanning the ship's diagnostics. Her glowing eyes reflected the flickering lights of the console, and John couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more about him than she was letting on. "I'm going to ask one more time," John said, his voice firm but low. "Who are you? And what do you mean when you say I saved you?" Lyra paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the controls. She let out a slow breath and turned to face him. "You want the truth, John. Fine. But it's not going to be easy to hear." John leaned back, crossing his arms. "I think I've earned a few straight answers." Lyra stood and motioned for him to follow her. She led him out of the cockpit and down the narrow corridor to a storage room at the back of the ship. She tapped a panel on the wall, and the lights flickered on, illuminating a small hidden compartment. Inside was a holographic projector, its surface worn and covered in scratches. "This," Lyra said, activating the device, "is a piece of your past." The projector hummed to life, and a figure appeared in the center of the room. It was a man clad in battle-worn armor, standing tall and resolute. John's heart skipped a beat as he realized the man looked exactly like him, but younger, stronger, and with an intensity in his eyes that John had never seen in himself. "What the?" John muttered, stepping closer to the hologram. The hologram flickered, and the man began to speak. His voice was deep and commanding, filled with a sense of urgency. "To anyone finding this recording, my name is Commander John Mercer of the Earth Alliance Fleet. If you're hearing this, it means I've failed to stop the Shadow Seekers from rising again. This message is a warning and a call to action." John stumbled back, shaking his head. "No, no way. That's not me. I'm just a mechanic. I've never been in the military." Lyra stepped beside him, her expression serious. "It is you, John. Or at least it was. The Shadow Seekers didn't just erase your memories. They erased your entire identity." John stared at her, his mind reeling. Why would they do that? What could I have possibly done to make me their target? A hologram continued, answering his question as if on cue. "The Shadow Seekers are a race of conquerors. They enslave and destroy any species that opposes them. Years ago, I led an assault on one of their camps, a prison where they kept thousands of innocent beings. We freed them and destroyed the camp, but the cost was high. They swore revenge on me and anyone who stood with me." Lyra nodded, her voice softening. "I was one of those prisoners, John. You led the mission that saved my life, and the lives of countless others. I owe you everything." John's legs felt weak, and he sank onto a nearby crate, his head in his hands. "This is insane. You're telling me I was some kind of war hero. And then what? They just wiped my mind and let me go back to being a nobody." "It was more than that," Lyra said, kneeling beside him. "The Shadow Seekers saw you as their greatest threat. They didn't just want you out of the fight. They wanted you to forget who you were so you could never rise against them again." John looked up at the hologram, watching as the younger version of himself outlined battle strategies and recounted the horrors of the war. He felt a strange mix of pride and fear. This wasn't the life he knew, but something about it resonated deep inside him. "Why now?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you telling me this now?" Lyra stood, her glowing eyes meeting his. "Because the Shadow Seekers are stronger than ever. They've been quietly conquering outer systems, preparing for a full-scale invasion of Earth. You're the only one who knows how to stop them. Somewhere in your mind, buried under the memories they erased, is the key to an ancient weapon. A weapon powerful enough to turn the tide of the war." John shook his head. "I don't remember anything about a weapon. I don't even remember you." Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder. "You will. The memories are still there, locked away. We just have to find a way to unlock them before it's too late." Before John could respond, the ship's alarm blared, cutting through the heavy silence. Lyra spun around, her face tense. "They found us again." "How?" John asked, his heart racing. "The tracker," Lyra said, rushing to the control panel. "They must have planted it on the ship before we escaped." John stood, his adrenaline surging. "Then let's get rid of it." "It's not that simple," Lyra said, her fingers flying over the controls. "If we remove the tracker now, they'll pinpoint our location instantly. We need a distraction." John thought for a moment, then his eyes fell on the hologram. "What about this? Can we use it to send a fake signal or something?" Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "It's risky, but it might buy us some time." She quickly reprogrammed the holographic device, broadcasting a decoy signal that mimicked the ship's energy signature. Moments later, the warning lights dimmed as the Shadow Seekers' ships diverted their course. John let out a shaky breath. "That's it. We're safe." "For now," Lyra said, shutting down the projector. "But they won't stop. We need to move quickly." John looked at her, his mind still racing with everything he'd just learned. He wasn't sure if he could trust her or himself, but one thing was clear. His quiet life as a mechanic was over, and whether he liked it or not, the fight against the Shadow Seekers had begun again. The truth within. The barren moon stretched endlessly in every direction, its jagged cliffs and shadowed craters illuminated by the faint glow of distant stars. John sat on a cold metal crate in the ship's storage bay, staring at his reflection in a dented tool panel. His face was familiar, but his mind felt foreign. Could Lyra be right? Could he really have been someone else? Someone important? Lyra entered the room, her footsteps light but deliberate. She carried a small device in her hand, a glowing crystal-like object pulsing faintly. "We don't have much time, John," she said, her voice breaking the silence. John glanced up at her, exhaustion and frustration etched across his face. "I still don't understand why they'd go through all this trouble. Why not just kill me?" Lyra sighed, setting the device on the crate beside him. "Because killing you would have made you a martyr. They don't want people rallying around your name. By erasing you, they ensured that no one would remember what you stood for, not even you." John scoffed, shaking his head. "Well, they did a great job. I don't feel like a hero. I feel like a guy who's in way over his head." Lyra knelt beside him, her glowing eyes filled with an intensity that made John uncomfortable. "You don't have to feel like a hero. You just have to remember who you are." She picked up the glowing device and held it out to him. This will help. John eyed it suspiciously. What is it? A memory trigger, Lyra explained. It was designed by your own team before the Shadow Seekers took you. It connects to the fragments of your mind that they couldn't fully erase. But, she hesitated, her expression turning grim. But what? John pressed. It's not perfect, Lyra admitted. The process is intense, painful, even, and there's no guarantee it will bring back everything. John let out a slow breath, staring at the device. The idea of reliving a life he didn't even know he had was terrifying. But the alternative, staying in the dark while the Shadow Seekers grew stronger, was worse. He reached for the device, his hand trembling slightly. All right, he said. Let's do it. Lyra nodded and activated the device. A faint hum filled the air, and the crystal pulsed brighter. She placed it against his temple, and the world around John seemed to dissolve in an instant. John was no longer in the ship's storage bay. He stood in the middle of a battlefield, surrounded by chaos. Explosions erupted in the distance, and the sky was filled with the deafening roar of ships clashing above. Soldiers, human and alien, fought side by side against a monstrous enemy. Their foes were towering, shadowy figures with jagged armor and glowing red eyes. At the center of it all stood another version of himself. This John was clad in advanced armor, wielding a weapon that hummed with an energy unlike anything John had ever seen. He barked orders to his team, his voice calm but commanding. Hold the line. The other John shouted. We can't let them break through. The memory shifted. John was now inside a dark, damp prison camp. Rows of cages lined the walls, each one filled with alien prisoners, their eyes hollow and their bodies frail. The smell of death hung heavy in the air. He saw himself moving from cage to cage, unlocking the doors and helping the prisoners to their feet. And then he saw her, Lyra. She looked younger, her silver skin bruised and scarred, but her eyes still glowed faintly. She clung to his arm as he led her out of the camp, her voice trembling with gratitude. You saved me, Lyra's voice echoed, blending with the memory and pulling him back to the present. John gasped as the world around him snapped back into focus. He was on the ship again, his heart pounding and his head throbbing. He looked at Lyra, who was watching him closely. I saw it, John said, his voice barely above a whisper. The battlefield. The prisoners. You. Lyra nodded, a faint smile on her lips. Your memories are still there, John. They've just been buried. The Shadow Seekers couldn't erase everything. John rubbed his temples, the images still flashing in his mind. I was a soldier, he said slowly. A leader. I fought them. But there's more. There's something I'm still not remembering. Lyra's expression grew serious. That's because the most important memory is locked even deeper. It's the one they tried hardest to erase. The weapon. John looked at her sharply. The weapon. You've mentioned it before. What is it? It's something you created, Lyra said. A weapon powerful enough to destroy the Shadow Seekers. But you hid it before they could take it, and the knowledge of its location is still inside your mind. John stood, his legs shaky, but his resolve firm. Then we need to find it. If this weapon can stop them, we can't waste any more time. Lyra nodded, but before she could respond, the ship's warning system blared again. A red light flashed on the console, and the sound of engines echoed outside. They'd found us, Lyra said, her voice tense. We need to move. John clenched his fists, the memories of his past life giving him newfound determination. Let them come, he said. It's time I started fighting back. Awakening the hero. The air inside the ship was heavy with tension as it ascended from the barren moon. Lyra sat at the controls, her glowing eyes fixed on the navigation screen. John stood behind her, his arms crossed, the weight of his fragmented memories pressing down on him like a physical burden. Where are we going? John asked, his voice steady but edged with uncertainty. Lyra glanced at him over her shoulder. There's a hidden outpost nearby, one you established during the war. It's where you hid the weapon. John blinked, trying to process her words. You're saying I hid a weapon powerful enough to defeat the Shadow Seekers, and then I just forgot about it. You didn't forget, Lyra said, her tone sharp. They made you forget. But if we're lucky, being there will trigger the rest of your memories. The ship shuddered as it entered hyperspace, and John leaned against the wall. He didn't know if he was ready to face more of his past, but he also knew there was no turning back now. An hour later, the ship emerged from hyperspace into the orbit of a desolate planet. Its surface was covered in vast canyons and ridges, the remnants of ancient tectonic upheavals. Lyra navigated the ship into the atmosphere, heading toward a mountain range that loomed like jagged teeth on the horizon. As they descended, the outline of a facility became visible, its structure carved directly into the side of the largest peak. It was old and weathered, but its design was unmistakably human. John felt a strange pang of recognition, like the faint echo of a song he couldn't quite remember. "This is it," Lyra said, her voice low. "Your outpost." The ship landed on a crumbling platform, its landing gear kicking up clouds of dust. Lyra powered down the engines and turned to John. "Are you ready?" John hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I don't think I have a choice." They stepped out into the thin, dry air, the wind tugging at their clothes. The entrance to the facility was sealed with a massive steel door, its surface marred by years of weathering. A small console stood beside it, its screen dark. Lyra tapped the console, but it remained unresponsive. "It's dead," she said. "The power's been offline for years." John stepped forward, brushing past her. Without thinking, he reached out and placed his hand on the console. To his surprise, and Lyra's, the screen flickered to life, and a soft voice echoed from a hidden speaker. "Welcome back, Commander Mercer." John froze. The voice was calm and mechanical, but it carried a tone of reverence, as if the facility itself remembered him. Lyra stared at him, her glowing eyes wide. "You didn't even hesitate," she said. "How did you know to do that?" "I didn't," John admitted. "It just felt right." The steel door rumbled as it slid open, revealing a long, dimly lit corridor. The air inside was stale but breathable, and the walls were lined with flickering lights that cast eerie shadows. John stepped inside, his heart pounding. The corridor led to a central chamber, where a massive holographic display dominated the room. Rows of consoles and monitors surrounded the display, their screens covered in layers of dust. As John and Lyra entered, the holographic display activated, filling the room with a pale blue light. The image of John's younger self appeared in the center of the chamber. He was clad in the same battle-worn armor from the earlier hologram, his expression grim but determined. "If you are seeing this," the hologram began, "it means the Shadow Seekers are back. It also means I failed to stop them the first time." John felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched his past self speak. "The weapon is here," the hologram continued. "It's the only thing powerful enough to destroy them. But it's not just a weapon. It's a key to something greater, something the Seekers fear more than anything." Lyra stepped closer to the hologram, her gaze fixed on it. "What does he mean, a key?" she asked. The hologram seemed to respond directly to her question. "The weapon is locked away in the vault of humanity, a repository of ancient knowledge and technology left behind by Earth's greatest minds. It contains everything we need to rebuild and defend ourselves, but only someone who truly embodies humanity's spirit can access it." John frowned. "And that's supposed to be me." The hologram turned toward him, its gaze piercing. "You are the chosen guardian of the vault, John. You were trained for this, prepared for this. If you don't take up this responsibility, no one else will." The hologram flickered and vanished, leaving the room in silence. Lyra turned to John, her expression a mix of awe and urgency. "This isn't just about a weapon. This is about everything humanity has ever fought for." John exhaled slowly, the enormity of the situation sinking in. "All right," he said. "Where is it?" Lyra pointed to a reinforced door at the far end of the chamber. "The vault is behind there. But the weapon's activation requires your genetic signature. No one else can open it." John approached the door, his mind racing. The hologram's words echoed in his head. "You were trained for this, prepared for this." But as he placed his hand on the scanner, he couldn't shake the doubt gnawing at him. Could he really be the person everyone believed he was? The scanner beeped, and the door slid open, revealing a vast chamber filled with glowing artifacts and advanced technology. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a sleek, cylindrical object. It was the weapon. Simple in design, but radiating a sense of immense power. As John stepped forward, memories flooded back. The battlefield. The mission. The oath he had taken to protect humanity at all costs. His hands trembled as he reached for the weapon. When his fingers closed around it, the chamber lit up, and a deep, resonant voice filled the air. "The Guardian has returned. Humanity's light will shine again." John turned to Lyra, his grip on the weapon firm. "Let's finish this." The final stand. The weight of the weapon in John's hands was unlike anything he had ever felt. Not heavy, but impossibly significant. It hummed softly, a pulse of energy that seemed to sync with the rhythm of his heartbeat. Lyra stood a few steps behind him, her glowing eyes fixed on the sleek, cylindrical device. "Do you feel it?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with wonder. "That's not just a weapon. It's alive. It's responding to you." John glanced back at her, his grip tightening on the weapon. "Alive? You're saying this thing is sentient?" "Not sentient," Lyra clarified, stepping closer. "But it's connected to the vault's core, a repository of knowledge that Earth's greatest minds left behind. It's as if the wisdom of generations is guiding you." John looked back at the weapon, his mind racing. He felt a strange connection to it, like a distant memory trying to claw its way to the surface. But there was no time to dwell on it. The warning lights in the chamber flickered, and the faint sound of an alarm echoed through the facility. "They're coming," Lyra said, her voice sharp with urgency. "The Shadow Seekers must have tracked us here." John nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we fight." Outside the facility, the barren landscape of the planet was transformed into a war zone. Dozens of sleek, black ships descended from the sky, their weapons glowing with deadly intent. Shadow Seeker soldiers disembarked, their jagged armor glinting under the faint starlight. They moved with precision, forming ranks as they approached the facility. John and Lyra stood at the entrance, the ancient weapon glowing faintly in John's hands. Lyra carried a blaster she had scavenged from the ship, but she knew it wouldn't be enough against the overwhelming force bearing down on them. "They'll overrun us in minutes," Lyra said, glancing nervously at John. "You have to activate the weapon now." John shook his head. "Not yet. If I use it without understanding its full potential, I could destroy this entire planet, and us with it." "Then what's the plan?" Lyra demanded. "Because they're not going to wait for you to figure it out." John's gaze swept over the advancing army. His mind was a whirlwind of fragmented memories and instincts, but one thing was clear: they needed to buy time. "We hold them off," he said, stepping forward. "Whatever it takes." Lyra stared at him for a moment, then nodded. "Let's hope you're as good as the holograms say you are." The first wave of Shadow Seekers charged, their energy weapons blazing. John ducked behind a jagged rock, his movements instinctive and precise. He raised the ancient weapon, which seemed to respond to his thoughts. A burst of energy shot out, striking a group of Seekers and disintegrating them in an instant. Lyra let out a low whistle. "All right. I'm impressed." "Focus, Lyra," John shouted, taking aim at another group. The weapon pulsed again, its energy arcing through the enemy ranks like a living thing. Despite its devastating power, the Shadow Seekers kept coming, their ranks seemingly endless. The ground shook as one of the larger enemy ships fired a blast at the facility. The structure trembled, dust and debris raining down from its ancient walls. Lyra fired her blaster at the ship, but its shields absorbed the attack effortlessly. "This isn't sustainable," she yelled. "We can't hold them forever." John gritted his teeth, his mind racing for a solution. He looked down at the weapon, its glow intensifying, as if it were responding to the escalating danger. A thought struck him, a memory from the holograms. "The vault," he said aloud. "The weapon isn't just for destruction. It's a key. It's meant to activate the defenses of the vault." Lyra's eyes widened. "Defenses? You mean this place has weapons of its own?" "More than that," John said. "If I can sync the weapon with the vault's core, it'll trigger an automated defense system designed to neutralize threats like the Shadow Seekers." "Then what are you waiting for?" Lyra asked. John turned and sprinted back into the facility, the weapon clutched tightly in his hands. Lyra followed close behind, firing at the advancing Seekers to cover their retreat. The sounds of battle grew louder, the enemy closing in on all sides. Inside the central chamber, John placed the weapon on the pedestal in the center of the room. The holographic display sprang to life, and the image of his younger self appeared once more. "Welcome back, Commander," the hologram said. "The vault's defenses are ready to be activated. Are you prepared to proceed?" John hesitated, his hand hovering over the pedestal. "What happens if I do this?" The hologram's expression was solemn. "The activation will unleash a targeted EMP wave strong enough to disable all Shadow Seeker technology within a 1,000-mile radius. However, it will drain the vault's power, leaving it dormant for decades. Are you willing to make that sacrifice?" John glanced at Lyra, who was holding the door, her blaster aimed at the advancing Seekers. "Do it, John," she shouted. "We don't have time." John took a deep breath and placed his hand on the pedestal. Activated. The vault's core began to hum, its glow intensifying as the energy built up. The walls of the chamber lit up with intricate patterns, symbols of ancient human ingenuity. Outside, the advancing Shadow Seekers hesitated as the ground beneath them began to tremble. A wave of energy erupted from the facility, spreading outward in a brilliant flash. The Shadow Seeker ships in the sky sputtered and fell, their systems completely fried. The soldiers on the ground collapsed as their weapons and armor became useless. Lyra watched in awe as the tide of battle turned in an instant. She turned back to John, who stood at the pedestal, his face pale but determined. "It's done," he said quietly. As the dust settled, the facility's lights dimmed, the vault's power completely spent. John and Lyra stood in the silence, the battlefield outside eerily quiet. Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, John. You stopped them." "For now," John said, his voice heavy with resolve. "But this isn't over. The Shadow Seekers won't stop until they're wiped out for good. And I'm not going to stop until they are." Lyra nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Then let's finish what we started." Humanity's light. The battlefield was eerily silent. Smoke rose in thin tendrils from the remains of the Shadow Seeker ships, scattered across the desolate planet like shattered relics of war. The vault's pulse had not only destroyed their forces, but rendered their technology useless for miles around. John stood at the entrance of the facility, the ancient weapon still warm in his hands, its glow dimming as if it, too, was exhausted. Lyra stepped up beside him, her silver skin faintly shimmering in the fading light. "It's quiet now," she said softly, her glowing eyes scanning the wreckage. "But it won't last. The Shadow Seekers will send reinforcements." John nodded, his face grim. "Then we need to finish this. We've dealt them a blow, but it's not enough. As long as they're out there, humanity, and everyone else, will never be safe." Lyra looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "You've changed, John. The man I met on that dusty starship dock wouldn't have said something like that." John glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Maybe I'm finally starting to remember who I am." Back inside the facility, the vault lay dormant, its glow reduced to a faint shimmer. John and Lyra stood in the central chamber, staring at the pedestal where the weapon had been placed. It now rested in John's hands, silent but still brimming with potential. "We need a plan," John said, breaking the silence. "The vault's defenses are offline now. We've bought ourselves some time, but we can't count on this place to protect us anymore." Lyra nodded, tapping into the holographic interface on one of the consoles. "The vault has data on the Shadow Seekers' fleet movements," she said. "If we can access it, we might be able to locate their main stronghold." "And if we find it," John said, "we take the fight to them." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about an all-out assault. That's not exactly a mechanic strategy." John smirked. "Good thing I'm not just a mechanic anymore." Lyra tapped a few more commands, and the hologram of John's younger self flickered to life. This time, it seemed more responsive, its gaze scanning both of them, as if analyzing their intentions. "Commander Mercer," the hologram said, its voice steady and calm. "You have accessed the final stage of the Vault's protocols. The data you seek includes the location of the Shadow Seekers Command Center, but it comes with a warning." "What kind of warning?" John asked, stepping closer. "The weapon you carry," the hologram explained, "is not designed for prolonged use. Its power is finite. Using it again at full capacity will drain it entirely, rendering it inert." Lyra's eyes widened. "So if we use it to destroy their command center, it will be the last time," the hologram finished. John stared at the weapon, its surface smooth and unassuming, yet filled with the potential to decide the fate of an entire galaxy. "That's a risk we'll have to take," he said firmly. "If this is what it takes to end them, then so be it." After downloading the data, Lyra and John returned to the ship. The Shadow Seekers Command Center was located on a heavily fortified moon, surrounded by an armada of warships. It was their heart, a place where all their operations were coordinated. Taking it out would cripple them, but the mission was a suicide run. As they prepared for the journey, Lyra hesitated. "John," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft, "you don't have to do this. You've already done more than enough." John shook his head. "This isn't just about me, Lyra. It's about humanity, and everyone else who's counting on us to stop these monsters. If we don't do this, who will?" Lyra met his gaze, and for the first time, John saw something like admiration in her eyes. "All right," she said, "but we do this together. No heroics." John smirked. "No promises." The final approach to the Shadow Seekers' stronghold was harrowing. Their ship darted through waves of enemy fighters, narrowly avoiding blasts of plasma and streaks of laser fire. Lyra piloted with skill and precision, her hands steady on the controls despite the chaos around them. Inside the cockpit, the tension was palpable. The weapon rested in John's lap, its faint hum a reminder of the responsibility it carried. Every second brought them closer to the heart of the Shadow Seekers' power, and to what might be their last stand. Finally, the moon loomed ahead, its surface covered in sprawling fortresses and energy towers. Lyra brought the ship down in a hidden ravine, far enough from the main base to avoid immediate detection. "This is it," John said, strapping the weapon to his back. "Once we're inside, we need to head straight for the core. That's where the weapon will do the most damage." Lyra nodded, checking her blaster. "Let's hope your memories are as good as they say they are." The infiltration was brutal. The Shadow Seekers were relentless, their forces swarming the base's corridors like a hive protecting its queen. John and Lyra fought side by side, their movements synchronized in a way that felt almost natural, as if they had done this before. Finally, they reached the core chamber, a massive, pulsating sphere of energy that powered the entire base. The room was heavily guarded, but John activated the weapon, its energy arcs cutting through the enemies like a storm. Lyra provided cover, her blaster taking out stragglers as they pushed forward. As they reached the core, John placed the weapon on the activation pad. It glowed brightly, its energy sensing with the core's frequencies. The chamber began to tremble, and alarms blared throughout the base. "We need to go." Lyra shouted over the noise. John shook his head. Not yet. It needs time to build up. The weapon's glow intensified, and John turned to Lyra, his expression resolute. Get to the ship. I'll hold them off. Lyra's eyes widened. No, we do this together. There's no time to argue, John said, his voice firm. If we don't stop them now, everything we've done will mean nothing. Lyra hesitated, her expression torn, but finally she nodded. You better come back, Mercer. John smirked. I'll try. As Lyra ran back toward the ship, John turned to face the oncoming waves of shadow seekers. The weapon pulsed in his hands, its energy building to a crescendo. He stood his ground, a lone figure against an army, ready to sacrifice everything for humanity's future. From the ship, Lyra watched as the moon's surface erupted in a brilliant flash of light. The Shadow Seekers' base was destroyed, their forces obliterated in one final act of defiance. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "You did it, John." As the dust settled, a faint signal crackled through the ship's comms. It was John's voice, weary but alive. "Lyra, pick me up. I'm not done yet." Smiling through her tears, Lyra set a course back to the surface. Humanity's light hadn't just survived, it had shone brighter than ever.